Jesus' community of foot washers, his public presence in Caesar's arena of death. We're going to be taking a look this morning at John 13:33 through 35. I think a pretty relevant text in light of the crisis that is upon us as a church. Some of you have heard this illustration before. It's my love one another illustration, but it's worth bearing again because that is our text this morning, loving one another. There was a preacher, very new, very, very young. I'm pretty sure it's probably a preacher's story too, but it's worth the story. This young man, new to the congregation, it's his first Sunday, and he's preaching for the first time apart from candidating. And the good people there are happy he's there and he's ready to take on the challenge, and they can't wait to hear his first message to them. So he preaches a message that really can be summarized in that phrase, love one another. He preached on Jesus' word that we ought to love one another. And he preached fairly well. The congregation liked it, and they responded by thank yous and smiles. And that Sunday was over. And so the next week, he's ready to preach, now his second sermon. And basically it's the same exact sermon, love one another. The people in the congregation were, kind and generous, and they thought, well, he's young. It was a great message, and it was good to hear it again. And they thanked him. And then a week went by, and his third sermon. He is now ready up in the pulpit, and the people are anticipating, and he preaches the exact same message again. Love one another. Now, I grant you, there are people in the audience that were wondering what's going on here, but first time great, second time, yeah, we needed that. Third time, it's, let's see, maybe we needed to hear it again. I don't know. That's basically what people were saying. And, he was young. He didn't probably know better from their perspective. And so the fourth Sunday comes, and he gets up to preach, and he preaches the exact same message again. Love one another. Now the congregation is kind of worried, and they've called the elders together and said, maybe you should speak to the young man and about this. And so the elders approached the new preacher and said, Pastor, we appreciated this message so much, and most people didn't even mind you repeating it, but a third and a fourth time you had preached the same exact thing. What's going on here? And the young man looked at the elders and said, well, when you all get this one down, we'll move on to the next thing. Love one another. That's something I think we need to hear, especially now, maybe over and over and over again. But let's take time right now to travel back to the first few centuries, the first few 100 years of church history. Most of us are familiar with the great Greco-Roman Colosseums and the brutality of what was considered entertainment, the gladiator fights in those days of the Roman Empire. In those great Colosseums, there was a theater of real, unashamed, intentional death that was designed to display the vertical nature of society, of social order, who had status and who did not, and also who was and who wasn't a person. Why do I start here? The arena of death and violence is, you must understand, still the experience of so many around the globe today, and maybe even here in the Hill. Certainly in the most urban centers in the U.S. Designed by default and intention in our very built environment, continues to affirm social vertical status and, dare I say, what we affirm as human. Yet Jesus and the gospel itself points to a leveling displayed in and through and by the church. A leveling. John 13 will paint a picture for us. Religion in the Roman Empire was widespread and huge and multiple, and yet no one would have imagined that by the early 4th century, Christianity had become a major world religion with adherents numbering among the most significant slice of the empire's population. But church didn't start out that way. The first small congregations had no power, no leverage of status, no influence, and certainly no money. So how? As we read through the early church literature and the church fathers, one would look almost in vain, really, for references specifically to the idea that we hold so dear today called evangelism, as a verbal witness, as a matter of the Christian faith and life. In fact, speaking would have probably been done nothing at the time, and no one would have listened anyway. Literally in the first few hundred years, Christian literature makes no reference to evangelists in the way we understand evangelism today, or even missionaries. So why? How did the church grow? Back in the arena games, say around AD 203, that's about 200 years after the death of Jesus, the Colosseum Amphitheater was a wonder of Roman engineering. Everything about the architecture and the events were to show off the vertical nature of life and society standing in the empire. Vertical. Starting with the lower honored sections, seated by wealth and influence, how the stands were then filled up to the top. The upper, the less socially and lower stationed in life. The sections were the visible center, right there at the bottom, magistrates, landowners, benefactors, the elite, of course, the Roman senators. The entertainment of the populace was to bolster status in the Roman Empire. Prestige. It was all for prestige, to show who had it and who did not. All affirming the vertical natures of society and civil life. All the while, who were in the death pits below, the forced entertainment of death at the bottom of the arena. Of course, the gladiators and the lions, but it was the bottom of society that faced death. Criminals, the unwanted, slaves, the abandoned, all for sport and entertainment. There we also find, eventually, small bands of Christians, but they faced death, faced the beasts and the gladiators differently. Their presence in the arena subtly subverted the carefully choreographed vertical event that was happening. The masses saw husbands, the paterfamilias, as we understand them, head of households, wives, slaves, doctors, former prostitutes, unwanted children, all standing together, expressing publicly right there in the arena Christian horizontality. That is some word, huh? Yes, that is actually a word, horizontal. I could hardly even say it. Horizontality. When one would fall, the others would help them up to face death standing. They did not defend themselves in any way. Although the whole of the Gospel and New Testament teaching is behind their behavior, it was in fact that Jesus left a foot-washing community and not a militia or even an academy to invade this world. This is how Christianity grew to overtake an empire. Here in John 13, we have a portrait along with Jesus' words, a powerful image and a reminder of what the Christian community is to look like in the private habits, certainly, of our worship, but out there in the public, in Caesar's arena of death. And I have said this many times about their gatherings together. They were actually public, and I've even said semi-public, in the sense that even though people weren't there, they were watching, they were looking, because the venue themselves were more open and not closed. The cliche is an easy one. Jesus had to leave, but he left a community. That's easy. The harder thing, John leaves a community of foot washers to show his love to a watching public world. Here's my thesis for this morning. Jesus' presence in the world is displayed by a mutual, loving church that demonstrates the leveling of humanity, the horizontality of God's love. Our focus in John 13:33 through 35, and how that's our focus, and how these verses stand out in the midst of the foot washing scene. Surrounded by a traitor among them, that's Judas, and Peter's brash and patient display of allegiance. Hear the text, John 13:33 and following. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I'm going you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. You see, it kind of matters, though. It's easy. It runs off the tips. We are to love, tips of our tongue. We are to love one another. But it really matters who the one another is, who the other is. Everything seems driven by these words from our Lord here, right here in chapter 13, and all through John 13 through 17. But we will center on these verses, though, right now, through the foot washing, and then the outer bookends of the text of Judas and Peter, and see how the narrative of John plays. There are three things I want to talk about here. Setting the stage with the foot washing example. The second thing is the juxtaposition of the traitor Judas and the brash and patient denier Peter. And thirdly, the power and habits of our text. The presence of Jesus is the loving one another church, the visible, tangibly leveling power of the gospel. So we come to number one, setting the stage with the foot washing example. Jesus is preparing his new community for his departure. John 13 through 17 is a long, seamless section of John's gospel that centers around preparing the new community for Jesus' departure. Almost every story and teaching is about Jesus' soon death, demise, departure, and how the new community is to exist or behave and be in the world. John is helping the future church to understand that Jesus' departure begins his presence through the church and helps us to grasp the marks of his left-behind community. This can be seen with the bookends of what I call the bookends, or the marks that surround chapters 13 through 17. In 13:1, it says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end." And if you skip almost all the way to the end of John 17, verse 26, "I have made known to them your name," talking to the Father, "and I will continue to make it known, that the love which you have loved me may be in them and I in them." But what of this foot washing as the lead here, and John chooses? He could have chosen almost any teaching, but he leads with the foot washing for this revelation to the church now in the world. This world will know this love that Jesus has through his church, which is his left behind presence. One author sees Jesus' foot washing action as sort of like a form of eschatological hospitality. The Son's final act of welcoming the disciples into the Father's household, as how the disciples themselves are to welcome others into the new house called the church. Have you ever wondered why foot washing isn't a means of grace, or at least one of the elements of our worship? Someone said if foot washing was a means of grace, no one would be saved. I certainly wouldn't. The early church did not adopt foot washing as a regular element of their gatherings. No mention in Acts, very little among the early fathers. This is especially odd since Jesus said in John 13:15, I have given you an example that you should also do just as I have done to you. Herein is the trajectory. I know some of us don't like that word, but it is a trajectory application. That is what the example of the foot washing was to do. Jesus adopts the position no Jewish head of household, no rabbi, no teacher would have, dressing the part of a slave and touching the dirty feet of his guests. In fact, they would have spared even Jewish slaves from the shame and unclean act of foot washing. For the host would have turned to a non-Jewish slave, first and foremost, to do this less than human menial task, foot washing. Jesus turns the student-teacher relationship on its head. In fact, he makes the whole event a rather mystifying gesture, as someone said, with an interpretation that would have turned everything about the vertical culture and social standing on its head. Here in John, it would strike us that Jesus didn't say, a student is not greater than his master, especially after referencing himself as teacher. Why didn't he? No, he makes the example deeper, more culturally subversive than he could ever have imagined. Jesus says, truly, in verse 16, truly I say to you, a servant, doesn't say even slave, doesn't even say student. A servant, really, the word is slave, is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. He uses the servant-master relationship to interpret the foot-washing parable so the disciples would be properly sent out as his community. First note, Jesus refers to slave. Banally, the translations say servant, like the ESV does. First in the comparison. He says the word slave first in the comparison between slave and master. We should not take it lightly that Jesus did not say a master is greater than his slave, or a master's slave is not greater than himself. Placing the master in the priority position grammatically, that's the way it would have been done. They would have left even the sense of the pattern of words with the master first, but he doesn't do it. Say it out loud. You can even hear the nuance. To have a slave first and the master second, even grammatically, was unheard of. And as the subject of a prepositional construction, too, this was unheard of in those days. This would have been highly anti-cultural, very unacceptable to put first what he did, and even overtly subversive. Jesus in the place of a non-Jewish slave foot washer, and then Jesus is actually taking the form of the slave foot washer, and then Jesus is not so cryptic reference to the slave-master relationship. Would have been striking. In New Testament times, slaves, mind you, were not persons, This would have elevated the status of slaves, of non-persons in the minds of the disciples. This is your example. There is a leveling of status, a horizontalization, if you will, that big word, of humanity, illustrated in Jesus' example of foot washing, washing the disciples' feet. This is how you be, and this is how you do church. It is ambiguous and somewhat anachronistic to speak of persons or personhood with respect to the Bible. It does not directly call a human being a person. However, it would not be possible for us moderns in our day or any day to speak of persons as we do without the impact of the Christian movement. The capacity to call someone a person is a consequence of the Christian revolution, as someone put it, that Christianity had brought about, the revolution that Christianity had brought about in the world. The concept of person had a far more limited function before the church had been let loose in the world. The Greek word prosopon, as with the Latin persona, was not used to indicate a person back then as we understand it in the modern sense. The root meaning, if you will, of these words refers to a mask or a false face worn by actors in a theater to portray a role or character. The Roman court system picked up the nuance of persona before the Lord, before the law. That is a face recognized before the law. In New Testament times, it was not accurate to refer to one standing before the law than it was to refer to someone as a person. The vertical nature of the empire can be seen in this. The role of an individual in civic life and amid social institutions became a significant legal referent. This permitted the Greco-Roman society's vertical social map, if you will. We can see in our own nation's experience, as many of us know, that many minorities were not recognized before the law because they were not persons. We still struggle with that today. But as the church penetrated into the warp and woof of the vertical social mapping in the Roman Empire, eventually slaves, along with children and women, became known as persons. The church's social maps, if you will, the church's social mapping, if you will, became horizontal. This is the power of the foot washing scene. This is what gives content to what it means to love one another. That is, to be and do church. This brings us to the second, the juxtaposition of the traitor Judas and the brash, impatient denier Peter. Some texts should scare us. We like comforting texts. That seems to be all the texts that are happening even today, right? We avoid the discomforting texts, and worse, we say they are often just for others, not me. Our text is bookended by two traitors, and yes, I said two traitors. Peter is a brash denier. He is also a traitor. But Jesus has predicted his traitor's heart. We need to hear that too. Above the love one another command we have in verse 21. After saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, speaking of Judas, truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. But on the other side of the command, love one another, we have verse 38. Jesus answered Peter's brash impatience, will you lay down your life for me? Truly I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. One turns Jesus into the authorities, betraying him with a counterfeit kiss. The other will deny even knowing him. Both traitors. Jesus washes the disciples' feet and said, I am giving you an example to follow. Wash each other's feet. Then he follows with the new command to love one another. So the world can clearly see who his followers are. Yet juxtaposed to the foot washing illustration, and the new command is this bookend set of miserable words about Judas and Peter. I need this. I need this, for right in the midst of my own ministry and Christian life, my self-assurance, my brash impatience, my arrogance stands as a warning to lead me back to grace, to the cross, to the God-awful. This is a real word, you know. Okay, we'll just say lousy because it's banal enough. The lousy foot-washing example of what it means to love one another. Yet this is also for the church, which is to show that horizontaling love one another amid the culture's vertical pressures to exercise a traitorous heart against Jesus and against this church, to wrongly display Jesus in the public arena of death in the world. This passage was especially important to the church in Ephesus, to whom most likely the Gospel of John was written. For we read in Acts that Paul's preaching in Ephesus produced a disruption in regard to the temple Artemis, causing the powers of that city to rise up against them, accusing Paul and his little band of travelers of scandal and blasphemy. Later, Paul predicted, similar to Jesus' prediction of Peter, that after his own departure, and we read this in Ephesians 20, verses 9 through 30, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among your own will arise men speaking twisted things to draw away the disciples after them. The church leadership is warned. The church leadership in Ephesus is warned. They need John 13 to relearn the position and meaning of foot washing. That is, loving one another so that the world may see they are Jesus' disciples, followers of the crucified foot washer. Paul himself uses himself as an example of his status as their servant. Verse 31, he says, in Acts 20, therefore be alert, remembering that for 3 years I did not cease night or day to admonish everyone with tears. And now I commend you to God and to the word of his grace, which is able to build you up and give you the inheritance among those who are sanctified. Verse 33, I coveted no one's silver or gold. You yourselves know that these hands ministered to my necessities and to those who are with me. In all things I have shown you that by working hard in this way, we must help the weak. And remember the words of our Lord Jesus, how he himself said it is more blessed to give than to receive. In a similar way as the foot washing, Paul shows a horizontaling of the times, horizontaling in the church as their servant. This is the remedy for traitors in a hurt church. Peter wanted nothing to do with it. He wanted Jesus and not the responsibility of loving one another. We are back to our text in John 13. He wants all Jesus. He wants Jesus, but he doesn't want loving one another. That displays Jesus' presence in a community. Peter ignored what Jesus said about loving one another and focused on what Jesus said about his departure. Peter refuses Jesus' words when he says, what do you mean I cannot follow you where you're going? I'd lay down my life for you. Brash impatience. For Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you now? Brash impatience is the seed to a treacherous, traitorous, unloving heart. We do that. We even sincerely boast of our allegiance to Jesus, but ignore the prime directive. Forgive me for the Star Trek reference. We ignore the prime directive to love one another. Perhaps in a subtle way, John is reminding us If we don't love the church, a church, we do not follow the Savior. Perhaps in crafting his story, this story, John reminds us that we can be bold to announce our allegiance to Jesus, but face sure denial of him through not loving the church. And catch this in light of the foot washing example, not welcoming all types of people into our ranks. For Jesus is quick to rebuke Peter. Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. Our allegiance to Jesus sounds so spiritual in the safety of an upper room, in the safety of a church building. Right now, we can't even use our church buildings. What sounds so good in the intimacy of a safe space, the upper room, a church building, a gathering of like-minded Christians somewhere, where Jesus is present, is harder in Caesar's arena of death, out there in the public, where we are to be on display, public display, loving one another, living a public life, contrary to the socially vertical ordering, by taking on the form of a slave. Sound familiar? Philippians 2, 5 through 11. And actually loving one another. This leads us to application. This leads us to the third point, the power and habits of our text, moving toward application. The presence of Jesus is the loving one another church, the visible, tangible, leveling power of the gospel. This text is a powerful text. Jesus reaffirms his plans for departure, probably a reference both to the cruel death on the cross and to his ascension, and gives his band of disciples a command to love one another. Why? So that the public onlookers will know that they are his disciples. The church is missional when it displays its foot-washing love for one another in public. What is interesting, or at least to the public, what is interesting is that the world of the New Testament, there were many societies, religions, cults, and bands that gathered together. All of them had dues of some sort. All these cults and these clubs and these societies, they had dues. And as a result, at a person's departure, his death, the group they belonged to would pay for the burial. If they were current, that is, in their dues. If not, the family was left on their own to finance the burial, which for many was near impossible. Then the church is let loose in the world, and things changed with this new society, this new cult, the church. No dues. And help no matter what with the burial of a family member. In fact, there was a common fund among them to help with all basic needs. They took seriously that there was to be no poor among them. This church also became known for its acceptance of women, abandoned children, and slaves into their membership. In fact, the women rescued abandoned children from exposure, death on the streets, and garbage heaps by adopting them into their families. Their churches rescued disgraced women who had to resort to prostitution and worse, temple prostitution. Death was relieved through the leveling of status, through a horizontalization of human beings. The church had become the presence of Jesus in the midst of death-filled watching public and a subversive counter to the vertically built social environment. I know that's all big words to say. Everything was leveled out. Leveled out. All right, this is the way we should be doing church. So first the disciples would have been happy to wash Jesus' feet. But wash each other's feet? No, that is something altogether different. Washing the feet of others is a task for the lowliest of servants. Peers don't wash each other's feet. Even Jewish slaves were exempt from the menial task. If there were any Gentile slaves about, or women, or even children, the foot-washing example of Jesus is the content of the love one another command. It is not just loving each other in the Hallmark postcard, feeling-centered way, but a demonstration of love that challenges the vertical affirmations of our culture and social acceptance. Second thing I want you to hear is this text speaks to Jesus' presence in the world through the church. Where is the church? In the foot washing. In its display in life as disciples of Jesus for all to see right there in Caesar's arena of death. Jesus' reference to receiving glory is explicitly a message about his continued presence after his departure. Juxtaposing his glory and the command to love one another is very important to hear. Verse 31 says, when he had gone out, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. And then verse 33, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I loved you. You are also to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. The earthly dwelling of Jesus' presence is associated with his glory and is now revealed through the local church. The church is the presence of Jesus, dare I say, in as much as it demonstrates the horizontal love that shows we are followers of the foot-washing Jesus. We want everything else to win. We want everything else to win people to Jesus, as if they will know you are my disciples by your service, your special events, your programs, anything but loving one another, anything but a pure, unadulterated love for one another that cuts across race and civil status and place of pride, taking on the form of a slave, a foot-washing community of disciples, living out Jesus in their community, in public. In closing, I'm reminded someone said, thank God foot washing is still somewhat distasteful. Otherwise, we would miss the point entirely. This text is an ironic text and is just as countercultural and subversive today as it was in Jesus' day. We need to work at the leveling habits of intentional inclusion and acceptance of those left behind, marginalized, unloved. We strike right at the heart of social status as the measure of life when we take on the form of a foot-washing, love one another community. Our actions and habits should put on display a more horizontal love that shows God's restoration of all things, a public display of God's cosmic reconciliation in a local public place. We ourselves cannot do this, love one another, without the grace of the gospel infecting our lives. We need to bathe ourselves in the good news, to be surrounded, to be surrendered to surrender, to cry out, Lord, help us to love one another. Nonetheless, this is how people will know we are his disciples. We are different. We are showing God's love in Jesus. This love levels. There is this horizontal-ing of people, where the vertical world of status is crucified and death is alleviated. All are welcome. This is how the church grows. It matters who the other is. The other isn't necessarily someone like us, someone we'd hang with, someone we can lord it over. The other person can be unlike us, strangers, unequals, all welcome. For one moment in worship, or even in a conversation, and seeking the needs of our neighbors, of our brothers and sisters in Christ. This is church. They, for one moment, are accepted and loved and appreciated. All types are treated with dignity by a local church, by CPC in the Hill, publicly displaying the foot-washing love of Jesus. That's the church in the Hill.